I would like to start this video with a quick note. This will cover both the P-39 Airacobra and P-63 Kingcobra in a double feature kind of thing, as the two planes are so similar that it's simply more practical to cover them in this style. That is all. Now, on to the video. In any military procurement circle, there are generally two types of beginnings for something. Most times, a company with an already large history of successful orders is approached and asked to create an iterative successor, or new product. This can be seen in Curtiss Wright's P-36 Hawk and later P-40 Kitty Hawk. Military contractors approach these companies because they can readily expect reliable results. Then there's the other type. The type that can be summarized under a few words like daring, innovative, or, in rare cases, crazy. Bell Aircraft Corporation, from its founding till their acquisition by Textron Incorporated, could easily be described as all three of those words all at once. While the P-38 was being designed by Skunk Works, Bell was working on the YFM-1 Airacobra, which looks like something straight out of a child's drawing with only the vaguest hints of what a twin-engine high-altitude interceptor should look like. But when the USAAC asked for a single-engine version of their earlier request in Circular Proposal X609, Bell, with perhaps a little less liquor and more wisdom, created the P-39. With an engine mounted in the center of the airframe just behind the pilot and the same 37mm cannon the P-38 tried to use in its beginning, the P-39 was looking to be a fairly quirky but effective high-altitude interceptor. But, with weight adding up and space in the relatively small rear section of the aircraft running out, something had to be removed, and that would end up being the turbocharger, leaving the single inbuilt one-speed supercharger of the Allison to cry and weep and only ever enjoy altitudes below 12,000 feet. Forever rendered as a low-altitude fighter, the P-39 would be somehow introduced in late 1941 after beginning production the previous year. But shortly before its official introduction to the US, and in a move that can probably be guessed by previous viewers of the channel, the British appeared. They asked Bell to supply them with the P-39s with the guarantee that the plane could reach just shy of 400 miles per hour at 14,000 feet. This would eventually lead to the P-400 export variant, which saw brief action in the Pacific and Western Europe. With America begrudgingly accepting the aircraft and other allies either replacing it in favor of domestic designs in the case of the British, there was only one customer left for the Airacobra, the VVS of the Soviet Union. Thankfully, however, with the stars aligned and circumstances playing into the P-39's hands, the VVS loved the P-39. If an Air Force could marry a plane, I'd argue the VVS would propose to the Airacobra on the spot. Being sent to the USSR over the Alaskan-Siberian ferry route, the P-39s would see most of its wartime usage on the Eastern Front against the Luftwaffe. Pilots loved the plane, citing its reliability and ergonomics as well as its heavy punch afforded by the 37mm cannon. Their only major complaints were with the 37's low fire rate and low ammunition count. Due to the Eastern Air War being much lower altitudes compared to the western side of the world, the P-39's major disadvantage was not a hindrance to its performance on this front. This would lead to the USSR effectively acquiring a monopoly on the P-39, ordering the vast majority of production runs of the aircraft, so much so that the P-39 would make up more than a third of all planes sent to the USSR via Lend-Lease, outnumbering Spitfires and P-40s by a considerable margin. As for aces using the P-39, 5 of the 10 highest-scoring Soviet aces achieved most of their victories in the P-39, with Alexander Pokriskin being the ultimate ace of the plane with 47 kills, also coincidentally making him the highest-scoring ace to use an American aircraft, beating out even Richard Bong. As a fun side note, when faced with the technically more capable aircraft like the Yak-3 or La-7, Alexander chose the P-39 and later P-63 for various reasons such as personally disliking Yakolov and an accident that killed a good friend of his involving the La-7, causing him to dismiss it in favor of Bell's Cobras. Moving off of the Eastern Air Front, the P-39 would fly elsewhere in smaller amounts, having some success in the Italian theater with the Regia Aeronautica after Italy switched to the Allies, and some more notable success with the Cactus Air Force of Henderson Field in Guadalcanal, where P-39s and P-400s flew against the Japanese in a desperate and successful attempt to hold the airfield. Australia would also use the type against the Japanese in Northern Australia and New Guinea, though only via loan of the USAAF's 5th Air Force, which based itself out of Australia. With service in the Eastern Front and some small successes in the Pacific, the P-39 was a relatively good aircraft, though its hidden potential would be unlocked after the war in the scene of the National Air Races, where Bell aircraft test pilots took two P-39s, increased the engine's horsepower to 2,000, and gave it a new propeller. Cobra 1, flown by Jack Woolams, was lost in 1946 in a test flight over Lake Ontario, while Cobra 2 would win the 1946 Thompson Trophy against modified P-51s and other P-39s. It would race again in 1947 and place third, but would never complete again, as its next race resulted in a DNF by engine difficulties. Cobra 2 was destroyed in an attempt to get the piston engine airspeed record, with Mike Carroll losing control and crashing Cobra 2 in 1968. 20 P-39s exist today, with 4 of them being airworthy in the USA, all others being under restoration or on display around the world. But that is not the end of this story, for another plane bore Bell's snake name, and flew just before the end of World War II, the aptly named P-63 Kingcobra. Beginning development almost immediately after the P-39 entered production, the P-63 was what the P-39 was supposed to be initially, including a better supercharger for actual amounts of high-altitude performance, and many other improvements which resulted in an overall bigger aircraft. A distinctive four-bladed propeller and larger rudder are the visual distinctions between a P-39 and P-63. During development, there were talks of introducing a Packard engine in place of the old Allison V1710. However, Bell was told no, and that P-51s needed all the Packards they could get. This angers me on a spiritual level, as later when the USAAF inspected the P-63, they deemed it inferior to the P-51 despite being the cause of the P-63 not being able to perform to its greatest strengths, being stuck with the Allison, even if it was a highly modified and supplemented with a two-stage supercharger. History will forever wonder if the P-63 could have matched a P-51 if it had a Packard installed. But, moving on, development of the aircraft would be a progressive thing even as it was produced and then exported to the USSR, who was very interested in the new aircraft, so much so that it would become very involved with the Kingcobra's development. Bell and the USSR worked closely on the Kingcobra, with several changes being from Soviet input, such as adding more ammunition to the 37mm cannon and moving it forward to better balance the aircraft. Other smaller improvements, such as more fuel, underwing hardpoints, and more pilot armor were also added at the Soviets' requisition. When these aircraft were finished, they were flown over the US and Canada to Alaska by Air Transport Command pilots, including those of the WASP program, where Soviet pilots would then fly them over the Bering Strait to the USSR. 72% of all P-63s were sent to the USSR, totaling up to a little over 2,000 aircraft. When it arrived in the USSR, it was technically not to be used against Germany, due to an agreement that all P-63s were to be concentrated in the Far East for a combined assault on Japan. Soviets, being Soviets, said yes to this, and then proceeded to ignore it by sending P-63s to fight Germany while stating that all Air Force units were still using the P-39. A fact that is confirmed by records of both sides after the war stating that Kingcobra's usage in the final months of Russia's war against Germany. Speaking of Russia's war against Germany, there was a misconception that due to the P-39 and P-63 having a 37mm cannon, that it was used as a tank buster, similar to that of the Il-2 Sturmovik. This is simply untrue, as the Cobras, while having a particularly powerful cannon, did not have the correct ammunition to fulfill such missions, being only supplied with high explosive rounds for the M4, as armor-piercing rounds were for all intents and purposes not supplied to the USSR. Russian pilots, being what they are though, Cobras were used to attack soft ground targets like trucks, artillery positions, or vehicle columns in opportunistic strafing runs, much like many other Soviet fighters, because if you've got ammo and the enemy is right there below you, why not? Back to Russia's war against Japan, P-39s and P-63s belonging to the VVS would tangle with the Japanese in Manchukuo and Northern Korea, even shooting down a Ki-43 in August of 1945. With the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Japan's surrender afterwards, these actions would thus cease. Post-war, France would receive P-63s as well and use them in the First Indochina War to a small degree, though these would be replaced by F-8F Bearcats as America refused to supply spare parts for their Kingcobras, leading to the entire fleet France had eventually being mothballed by late September of 1951. Britain would receive 2 P-63s for scientific research into the benefits of laminar flow under the Royal Aircraft Establishment, and proved very enlightening to how beneficial laminar flow is and how much surface work one must do on a wing to get the most benefit out of it. In America, meanwhile, Kingcobras were doing two odd things. The first was being live target practice. These were known as the pinball operations, with all armament being removed and lots of armor plating and sensors being installed, complete with a light on the propeller hub that indicated if a hit was scored or not. For clarification, these were not remote-operated P-63s. These were manned by what I have to assume are either exceptionally brave, well-paid, or brave and well-paid pilots. There is, however, some sanity to this, as instead of using live wartime ammunition, special frangible rounds that disintegrated on impact and thus did little damage were used in place of actual wartime ammunition. The other odd thing Kingcobras did is the same thing that much of their younger brethren, the P-39, did: air racing. P-63s with the improved engine would be a fairly common sight at the air racing scene post-war. Tragically, however, almost all of the P-63s involved in air racing seemed to have a rather unceremonious and abrupt fiery end. Charles Tucker purchased two P-63s after the war and entered one called the Tucker Special as Race 28, named Flying Red Horse, and the Thompson Trophy race of 1946. This P-63 is notable for having its wing clipped by 12 feet, a measure done to try and improve speed and reduce drag and weight. I unfortunately could not find any information about what rank he placed, but given that a P-39 scored first, I think it's safe to say it didn't give him enough of an edge. His other plane, simply called Race 30, was used in the 1946 Bendix cross-country race, and had its wings clipped, though to a much less extreme degree than the Flying Red Horse. The Tipsy Miss by John Sandberg was another P-63 that made its name big in the racing world. Unfortunately, the Tipsy Miss never scored a victory and was destroyed in a fatal accident in 1990 after being sold to a European pilot. The last race P-63 to be covered is the Crazy Horse by Larry Haven. It is the most radically different and modified P-63 of the bunch, and to my personal opinion just looks ludicrous. It, too, would unfortunately not survive to today, being lost in 1972 after crashing into the ocean on a test flight. Due to the nature of the P-63, its massive export to other nations, and seeming lack of personal preservation in the years following World War II, even fewer P-63s exist today, with only 14 still being around in various states, only 4 of which are airworthy in the USA. With Bell having struck gold with the P-39 and P-63 success with the USSR, they would try and create the US first jet fighter with the P-59 Airacobra, though that aircraft would end up being a flop. They would find great success in helicopters later on down the line, and, more famously, a lot of various experimental aircraft starting with the Bell X-1. They would also help support NASA's space endeavors by providing both the reaction control system on the Mercury space capsule and later North American's X-15, and both the Lunar Landing Research Vehicle and Lunar Ascent Engine for the Apollo program. Though after these endeavors, Bell Aircraft would be acquired by Textron Incorporated after financial difficulties, leading them to focus more on helicopters under the stewardship of Textron for both the civilian and military side of things. But that is a story for another time.